Good morning on this 5th day of July. I hope you were all able to celebrate Independence Day yesterday in a way that was both meaningful and satisfying to you. We celebrated our freedom at my house by smoking ribs and eating too much with family members and then visiting a neighbor on his porch. And then I chose the Boston Pops salute on TV as my patriotic show for the evening. One performer introduced her song as having a little bit of Appalachia, a little bit of Ireland, and a little bit of West Africa. You know, she said, it's an American song. And then they had a sing-along, and I sat there, sentimental me, tears welling up, singing with them those great patriotic tunes that we know. My country, 'tis of thee, your grand old flag, Yankee Doodle Dandy, God bless America, and this land was made for you and me. I also took some time yesterday to read some articles that were published for the 4th of July, and I'd like to share a couple of things that I gleaned from them about how America is to be a great country, and then we'll see what today's gospel has for us. We all know that one sign of true greatness is having the wisdom to seek truth at whatever cost. One writer offered the usefulness of what he called double consciousness in seeking wisdom. He said double consciousness is a duality, a both and, that comes with being able to see yourself clearly and also being able to see yourself as others see you. A relative of mine who grew up in Middle Georgia has gained this perspective over the years. He remembers riding through his small hometown when he was a teenager, piled in the back of a pickup truck with his other white friends on the 4th of July, waving an oversized big American flag and making quite a ruckus. And he says now, when he thinks back on that experience, he sees how they looked to the black kids in town who would have been stopped for doing the same thing. And he now sees that their use of the flag on that day probably had only furthered a wedge of separation and inequality. Double consciousness. And another quality that follows double consciousness is the ability to know when it's time to make a change. I read that the American flag itself reflects that our country is a work in progress, that our flag has been updated nearly 30 times since 1777, more changes than any other flag in the world, because we are a work in progress. So let's keep these positive traits in mind as we look at Jesus' words for today. The wisdom to see yourself clearly and to see yourself as others see you, and the ability to know when it's time to make a change. Let me take us first to Dennis the Menace. With his overalls and his red and white striped t-shirt and his cowlick. And if we know Dennis, we know Margaret, chin up, curls bouncing, and skirt flouncing. How many times have we thought about Margaret if she could only see herself like we see her? The comic strip began way back in 1951, so this particular strip is stereotypical of that era. Margaret's coming toward Dennis on the sidewalk one day, pushing her baby buggy. And she says to Dennis, "You know why men are so lousy when it comes to taking care of babies?" Dennis says, "'Cause men have better things to do." And Margaret says, "Like what? Take a nap in the hammock?" Dennis said, "No, like hunting and having wars and driving cars and shaving. Do you know how to do all those things?" Margaret says, "Well, if you didn't have women, you wouldn't have babies, and there wouldn't be any people in the world." And then little Joey, always the peacemaker coming up behind, says, "But if you didn't have men who'd drive the ladies to the hospital." boys and girls trying to fit themselves into an adult world, figuring out their roles in life and needing to validate themselves. Jesus gives a similar scenario in today's gospel scene. Boys and girls are sitting in the marketplace, and the boys call out to the girls, "We piped to you and you did not dance." And the girls call back, "We wailed and you did not mourn." These children are mimicking two traditional adult activities they've seen their adults do. The round dance was done by the men at the weddings, and the ritual wailing by the women at funerals. Jesus used the two traditional activities, boys being the wedding dancers and girls being the funeral mourners, to point out what was going on at that time around him. How one group can try to validate themselves by making a comparison to another group. The Pharisees were doing this as they compared John the Baptist's disciples to Jesus' disciples. Isn't it much the same with us today? We have our group and we say, they're not like us. And because they're not like us, they should want to be like us and they need to catch on. Like those children, we are all taking part in one way or another in a big name-calling game. If we could only see ourselves the way others see us. Well, Jesus is exasperated by the whole thing. The religious establishment had been observing John the Baptist. John came neither eating nor drinking, meaning he practiced a very severe asceticism. And in their eyes, because he did not conform to their behaviors, they said he must have a demon. They were also critical of Jesus' behavior. Jesus came both eating and drinking. His more flexible, relational, inclusive approach broke way too many rules. He frequently attended banquets and ate with those whose actions were considered unclean and immoral. So they deemed him a drunken and a glutton. John and Jesus aren't playing by the rules, and they are getting called names. But here's the thing. John and Jesus may be very different in the way they deliver their message, but they are both from God, and they are both playing their assigned parts in getting God's message across. So then Jesus says, wisdom is known by her deeds. Meaning, although Jesus and John may have appeared to be opposites in how they lived their lives, if they are seen by others the way they are seen in God's eyes, they are both, in their different ways, playing their part, taking their place in God's providence. Jesus' statement leads us to the wisdom literature of Ecclesiastes and these familiar words. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. A time to be born and a time to die. A time to plant and a time to pluck up what's planted. A time to kill and a time to heal. A time to break down and a time to build up. A time to weep and a time to laugh. A time to mourn and a time to dance. Each action has its proper place within the rhythms of life. But Ecclesiastes says, when vanity gets in the way, vanity being only being able to see one's own reflection in the mirror and then seeing only what one wants to see of oneself, when vanity gets in the way, our interconnectedness within these rhythms of life breaks down, and people take to shouting at each other and taunting each other instead. Basically, Ecclesiastes says this: for those who take life into their own hands and are determined to operate as puppet masters, life will be a burden of toil for them and for those they master. For those who place their lives in God's hands, Ecclesiastes says, God will give them wisdom and knowledge and joy. So Jesus says, take my yoke upon you. Jesus' yoke upon you is not a heavy wooden mantle to which your neck is bound, but it's like a kite tied to heaven. Rather than hold you down, Jesus means my yoke will lift you up. Stop making children's games out of the wondrous rhythms of this life in which we are all placed together. It's like our life in God has strings for us to hold on to, and they give us a lift, and these strings are holding on to the mystery and the beauty of all that God provides for us, yet we cannot grasp it. They are like being given a kite on a windy day, and God has given us the string to hold, to run with, to keep just enough tension, to let out and to reel in with the wind. But when we grasp at the kite itself and bring it down, thinking we can have control of the strings, we get things all upside down. And so Jesus says, let go. Let go of your struggles with each other. Let go of your need to judge one another, to hold sway over one another, to think you're being right about this world is gotten by getting your hands on the kite and letting the strings dangle below you. And so to the Pharisees, and perhaps to us, he was saying, let go. To them, he said, let go of your religious codes that you want revered and your ideologies that you hold to be above all others. What vanity. Rather than you bearing the burden of holding others down, let go and allow God to lift them up and enjoin them as God will. This is a time to seek wisdom. This is a time to have the humility to see ourselves as others see us. This is a time to know when to make a change. How is God transforming you in these odd days? How is God transforming this world, this nation, this community, God's very own church? How is God reshaping us? It can only be for the good, for God is good. God is love. I know we want to grab hold of what seems solid, but let's hold on to that which will lift us up and carry us forward into the wind and will of God. And on this day after Independence Day, I'll close with this prayer. God bless America, land that we love. Stand beside her and guide her through the night with the light from above. Amen.